Welcome to Miami, Lawrence.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
What a great crowd. Wonderful to be here at the Miami Book Fair. There are so many important moments that you discuss in the books, but I want to talk about a moment that happened in Miami Beach. Let's start local here, because Miami Beach played a pretty important role in this campaign in 1968 for Richard Nixon. But it was a moment that President Nixon may not have had. It was a bit of a messy Republican National Convention on the beach. Talk to us about that.
Well, it was messy only on the inside. On the outside, the networks thought they were covering one of the most boring conventions that they'd ever had to cover because it was so organized and because the Nixon campaign was the first modern corporate campaign. It became the model for all future presidential campaigns because it had this corporate efficiency, which by the late 1960s had become the ideal for all organizations. But on the inside, there was real hope that Nixon could get derailed from the nomination. He was not stopped, had no real serious challenges during the primaries. But most states didn't have primaries then, so you could come into a convention without even having competed in the primaries and steal the nomination away. And a couple of people came to Miami Beach for the convention with that in mind. Nelson Rockefeller was one of them, and Ronald Reagan was the other. And you had the most conservative member of the party, Ronald Reagan, the most conservative possible presidential candidate, and the most liberal possible presidential candidate, Nelson Rockefeller. And you'll remember, that was back in the day when there was something called a liberal Republican. That breed has gone extinct, as has the conservative Democrat. There were conservative Democrats back in those days too. And so the intrigue inside the convention operations was, could Rockefeller and Reagan combine to somehow deny Nixon a first ballot victory for the nomination? Because if they could, confidence in Nixon would then collapse, and Rockefeller figured out he'd be able to catch up and take the nomination away somewhere around the fourth ballot. And this drama was really steaming in the background of what on television appeared to be an otherwise just flawlessly smooth convention. And in the end, the corporate organization of Nixon and the political organization of Nixon prevailed, and he got that first ballot victory that he needed in order to put down any possible insurrections. But that's the kind of thing I discovered in the research of the book, because I was a kid in high school at the time watching all of this on TV, and there was nothing remarkable about the Republican convention, nothing worth talking about. And when I began the research of the book, I didn't expect that it would take up as much space as it did. And it turned out there was wonderful stuff in there, and just fantastic characters in George Romney, in Nelson Rockefeller, and Ronald Reagan, who really added a tremendous amount of texture and drama in a section of the book that I thought was going to be, just a thin, quick, a couple of pages, we're done with that convention and we're out. That's true of every area of the campaign. It's filled with things that you could not know from the outside, and that we've been able to unearth over the decades since.
So one of the lessons is politics is a lot messier than it appears to be on TV.
Yeah. And one of the things that happened here in Miami Beach, in the coverage, changed television history, and it changed what you're going to watch on TV tonight. If you make the mistake of watching CNN instead of MSNBC. And that is bought and paid for argument TV, where I get, I hire and pay this person who dramatically disagrees with this person just so I can watch them yell at each other on TV. That was invented right here in Miami Beach at the Republican Convention in 1968 because ABC could not afford to do full convention coverage. And so they decided to try to come up with something that would be an alternative to the expensive coverage of everything that's going on the floor. And they asked William Buckley, would he come on and do 10-minute debates with a liberal? And Buckley said, sure. So they signed William F. Buckley, Jr. And they said to him, who would you most like to debate? What liberals would you most like to debate? We'll see who we can get. And he said, Ken Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith, Harvard economics professor, good friend of Buckley's, a Kennedy liberal, worked in the Kennedy administration. And he gave a list like that. And then the last thing they said to him was, who's the last person you would want to debate? The absolute, just tell us who we should not even talk to. And he gave them 3 or 4 names. The one he absolutely didn't want to debate was Gore Vidal. ABC immediately called Gore Vidal, made him an offer because they wanted to see the most explosive TV that they could see, and they got it. And Buckley and Vidal, both these American aristocrats, very polished people, as you know, began debating in fairly polished terms, and it eventually, by the time they got to the Democratic Convention, it went haywire. And Buckley really lost his temper, but the TV executives all said, wow, that's great TV. That's great TV. And you see its descendants today in argument TV.
There was a moment, and I think it was during the 68 Republican, it could have been the 72, because I think they came back in the 72 campaign, where the television set literally falls down on them during their live debate, which feels like it was a metaphor for what was to come here. Let's talk about transformation in that 1968 campaign, and we have to look at it through the lens of what we've just seen in 2016. The 2016 campaign, not exciting enough for you, Lawrence? Not transformative enough?
Well, I started writing this book about 3 years ago. And I thought, I'm going to write a book about the most chaotic presidential campaign in history. And I would argue, because I'm attached to this argument, that it still is the most chaotic campaign, and I will make some points about that. But here's what it also was. It was by far the most dramatic and unquestionably the most violent. And it was at a much darker time than now. We were at war in Vietnam. In the year 1968, 16,000 war dead for the United States in Vietnam, 16,000. And just for scale, all of the United States war dead in Afghanistan and Iraq in 16 years amount to about 6,500. So 1 year of Vietnam, 1968, was more than double the totality of everything that's happened to American soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so the country was coming apart over this. And 2016, when you look at it, if we just take the names off and you just step back and look at it, it is an absolutely standard presidential campaign in every way, except for one extremely eccentric candidate. All the rest of it is something we've seen before, especially on the Democratic side. We saw the insurgency on the left in 2016 against the Democratic Party's establishment choice. That was invented in 1968 by Eugene McCarthy when he decided to run against his own Democratic Party president, Lyndon Johnson, and challenge him, go up to New Hampshire and challenge him. Gene McCarthy did very well in New Hampshire, and so Bobby Kennedy jumped in. And you saw this very energetic insurgency from the left of the party against the Democratic establishment, and very successful one. And then on the Republican side, we saw some models on the Republican side that are echoed today. George Wallace, who had been a Democratic segregationist governor of Alabama, was running in 1968 as an independent, third-party candidate. And as he said to reporters then, I don't talk about segregation anymore, I talk about law and order. And Nixon heard that phrase. He heard Wallace say that in 1967, and Nixon took law and order. And he took that phrase, and he made that his own. Nixon became the law and order candidate because he needed to be heard by the Wallace voter. He wanted to get the Wallace voter. He needed the Wallace voter. And Tom Turnipseed was George Wallace's campaign manager in 1968. He told me last year that when he listened to Trump campaign, he was hearing George Wallace. And both in style, in the lack of substance, a kind of general resentment politics that Trump was practicing was exactly what Wallace was doing. And Wallace was the very first presidential campaigner who decided that the protesters in his audience were a gift to him. He actually went up to Dartmouth, went up to Ivy League College in New Hampshire, and was yelled at by the then hippies in the audience, the long-haired protesters, and Wallace loved it. And he pointed at them and he called them commies and pinkos, and he yelled right back at them like that. And not another presidential candidate has ever thought that was a good idea until Donald Trump. In 2016, Donald Trump is standing at his rallies with the microphone, and a protester starts making some noise over there, and he says, "I want to punch him in the face." And his audience loves that. And what he's saying to his audience is, "I hate him as much as you do." He's saying to his audience, "I hate the people you hate." And that's what George Wallace was saying to his audience. And so the roots of what occurred in 2016 and what have become the permanent templates of our politics were all set in cement in 1968, and that cement has just hardened now over the years.
Has it cracked or broken at all in 2017?
Well, we don't. Trumpism and Trump appear to be a one-time phenomenon. It appears to be the cult of an individual, and it's hard to imagine that there will be someone else who can come along and pick up that mantle. And when you look at who his vice president is, for example, he is behaviorally the exact opposite of Donald Trump. He couldn't be more extremely opposite to Trump. And so if Trump is a one-off and we don't see it again, then it was just this strange flare that burst into the Republican skies.
How did that 68 campaign that you chronicle in detail influence policy? And where do you see those roots from 68 growing green shoots, or other colored shoots for that matter, through today, through the policy mechanism?
So the income tax rate, federal income tax rate, in 1968, the top income tax rate was 70%. 70%. And not one candidate for president ever mentioned it. Never mentioned it. Richard Nixon never said, we have to chop down that top tax rate of 70%. Richard Nixon's policy platform simply said, if we can control the action in Vietnam and extract ourselves from Vietnam and save some defense spending, we will try to reduce taxation accordingly. And so that's how much policy did not play a role in our politics in 1968, except for exactly one thing. There was really only one policy in the 1968 campaign, and that was war policy. That was the Vietnam War policy. And Eugene McCarthy was the first one to understand that the 1968 election was going to be about life and death. And it was going to be about life and death of people who we knew. This was not the theoretical life or death that is posed existentially by the nuclear age and by the possession of nuclear weapons. This was the draft card that was in the pocket of every 18-year-old male and older. The draft card could be his ticket to death in Vietnam, and Gene McCarthy could end all that. If he could get the Vietnam War on the ballot, if he could dump Johnson, as they called it in those days, Bobby Kennedy could end all that if he won and if he was able to stop the Vietnam War and stop shipping these soldiers out to their deaths in what had become by 1968 a hopeless war. It was clear it couldn't be won, it wouldn't be won. That was absolutely clear. I was a kid in high school in 1968, and I was smarter than the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the President combined as were most kids in high school at the time, because we believed this was hopeless, this could not be won. And we were proven exactly correct, that it could not be won. America lost the war. And we, the last man to die for this mistake died in Vietnam on January 29th, 1975. And if Gene McCarthy had not run for president in 1968, that war would not have ended in 1975 for the Americans. If he had waited until 1972, if Bobby had waited until 1972, it would not have ended then, unless Bobby won, it would not have ended, in 1975. And so those peace candidacies and that peace movement ended that war and ended that draft sooner than it was going to. And in that sense, saved lives, saved thousands and thousands of lives in Vietnam. That's right, and saved thousands of American lives.
You mentioned the scale of the American casualties in Vietnam on an annual basis compared to the scale that we've seen with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But those wars are now the longest wars that America has fought and continues to fight. And I'm wondering, why do you think that this military action has not played a more significant role in our domestic politics like it did in 1968?
That couldn't be easier. No one has a draft card in their pocket. And so that made it an immediate threat to everyone. And so, you didn't have to be an 18 or a 19-year-old boy. It could be your grandson you were worried about. It could be your nephew you were worried about. It could be your cousin. It could be your boyfriend. It could be your brother. And so everyone was worried about someone. My cousin Johnny graduated from West Point in 1968, and 90 days later, he was dead in Vietnam. My first military funeral was Johnny's funeral in 1968. And so no one was untouchable by this. It was your neighbor. If you didn't have any relatives even, you knew people, you had friends, you knew someone. The threat was immediate, it was personal, it was real, and it was extreme. And this was the first time that a real anti-war movement broke out in the United States. And I don't believe it would have broken out without that individual threat. And the military figured that out too. That is why, one of the reasons why, the military advocated an all-volunteer army, because they knew that this would be the reaction in the future. If we have an all-volunteer army, we know where those volunteers are going to come from. It's going to come from less than 5% of the population. Less than 5% of the population will ever consider contributing anyone from their family to the military. And so we will not have this kind of wide-ranging protest to any engagements that might be unpopular that we get ourselves into. And so the all-volunteer choice had many, many dimensions to it, but that was a very important one.
Let's open up for audience questions here. We've got a microphone right center. I know that we want to bring questions in and have a good long time to answer those. Lawrence, as the folks line up, you have called, in a conversation I think that you recollected in Salon magazine with millennials, you have called Trump the Vietnam for the millennial voter.
Yeah, I didn't. A 22-year-old said it to me. I was talking to some college kids the day after the election when Trump was elected, and these were all pro-Hillary college kids, and so they were devastated by this election and felt alienated and couldn't believe that this person had been elected president in their country. And it was an extremely dark time, and there was a lot of crying happening out there in that part of the world, part of our country. And I listened to this and I started to tell them the story of 1968 and how there was this tremendous hope for a peace candidacy and an anti-war candidate. And in the end, one of the war candidates won, and the war was continued unnecessarily for years and years, and how dark that seemed and how hopeless that seemed and how it was worse. And it was 16,000 dead bodies worse in 1968. and so forth in other years, right up to 1975. And so they heard that, and they understood that their boyfriends don't have draft cards, and that they don't have draft cards, and they're not personally threatened by the Trump presidency. They won't lose their lives from it. That's not part of the risk. But having heard everything about what it felt like to live through the 1960s and the Vietnam era, what they said back to me after I said all that was, well, this is our Vietnam. And I thought, well, you're right, because the feeling inside is the same for them. The feeling inside is one of this long, unendurable situation, this 4 years of a presidency, what for them will be the presidency in the dark. And these are kids who, for the previous 8 years of their lives, their president had been Barack Obama. Barack Obama was a normalcy to them in their lives. And he was someone who they were very excited about to be president. And so they are feeling, I think, as alienated as I felt in high school from the presidency, as I felt in college from the presidency. It's a different set of dynamics that have created it, but I completely understand why they feel that way. But all of the facts, when taken into consideration, it's very clear it was much worse, and we had much more to recover from in the aftermath of all of that. And for the most part, we did recover from it.
We'll have to talk a little bit more about how we did that, but we do want to get as many questions in as possible, so if you can just keep your comments to the question, that'll be great. Hi, good evening.
I have a simple question. Are we currently in a civil war?
No.
Thank you.
All right, fair enough.
Please keep them as simple. I have a live television show to do in a few hours, and I don't want to get too complicated here. We can get through a lot of questions.
Well, let me ask a question of you that I asked Dan Rather last night. When you look at the electoral map and see those red states and blue states, does that discourage you? Does that give you optimism? Does it give you pause?
Well, I tell you what my first biggest discouragement about the whole thing was. And it came at the end of my 7 years or so, a little more, working in the United States Senate. And that is that, and I hated to conclude it, and I hate to say it out loud, but the United States Senate is an anti-democratic institution. And I revered the institution when I worked in it, and I had that big sense of superiority that people in the Senate have over those people in the House. And by the way, they have a sense of superiority over the Senate and all that. And I firmly believe that the Senate was our most important institution, and certainly the best people I knew working in government at elective office were senators. Not a lot of them, but they were there. And so it was a painful thing to conclude. But that is going to remain our problem no matter how we want to look at this, and no matter who wins presidential elections. Not all votes are equal in the United States, and not close to being equal. They're not going to be. And so we are struggling with a design that is fundamentally anti-democratic at the senatorial level. And that then infects the Electoral College, which is fundamentally anti-democratic. And so once you start looking at red and blue and all of that stuff, that wouldn't matter so much if we were actually counting votes, like in a democracy. And we don't. So that's how you're going to get reds and blues. I mean, what would we care? If it said red and blue, we wouldn't care if you didn't do this electoral college imposition on top of democracy. We go, we don't care that most people in California vote Democrat and most people in Alabama vote Republican. Who cares? What's the total? That's all we'd want to know. I mean, I've been an election observer in foreign countries. I was an election observer in Azerbaijan one time. And, we'd go around and we'd see the devices they're using for the ballot boxes and all that stuff and nod and go, okay, that looks pretty secure. We get it, And then we would have to write a little report saying this is what we saw. you wouldn't write a report saying this is a fair election. You'd simply would say this is what we saw. And we saw no evidence of any tampering or any anti-democratic activity. If at the end of election day and the day after, someone in Azerbaijan came to us and said, thank you very much, this is really helpful, but a month and a half from now when you're back in the United States, we're going to have another group of people meet, and they're going to decide who actually won today. We'd go, well, we can't certify this. We can't sign off on what we just saw. It's meaningless what we just saw. We would never, as election observers, agree to certify an election process that ended with an electoral college. We would say that's not democracy.
Thank you for your patience. Go ahead. Good evening.
My question is about the Alabama senatorial candidate. My question to you is, why is he being allowed to get away with the fact that women who are coming forward can be discredited because they haven't told their story in 40 years? I serve as the executive director of Christie House in Miami-Dade County. And we've been serving children who are victims of sexual abuse for the past 22 years. We know here in Miami, and national experts know, that it is so common for an adult survivor of child sexual abuse to wait 30, 40, 50 years, or to take that horrific story to the grave with them. And why is he being allowed to get away with this and no one is confronting him?
Well, he's not being allowed to get away with it as of now. And the story changed dramatically today through the power of video, because today is the first time that one of these women, the new accuser who emerged today, spoke on video. And she said a couple of very important things. One is, she said she voted for Donald Trump. And I believe that is going to have an effect on Donald Trump, because everyone who says they vote for Donald Trump is someone Donald Trump tends to side with. So I will not be surprised if Donald Trump has more of a problem with Roy Moore tonight than he did last night. But also, this is, this is an ongoing process. Mitch McConnell switched today dramatically from saying, if these accusations are true, to saying something quite reasonable, which is, I believe the women. And I think one of the other Republican senators over the weekend put it very well when, having listened to Roy Moore's defense on Sean Hannity's radio and TV show, he listened to that, and the Republican senator said, I think the accusations have more credibility than the defense. Now, that's not a jury verdict. A jury verdict is beyond a reasonable doubt. But everywhere else in your life, outside of the jury system, you are allowed to make decisions based on levels of credibility and say, I think this is more believable than that. It's not scientific proof, but it's the way human beings go about their lives. And so Mitch McConnell has gotten there. There's a bunch of scenarios possible, which I was saying from the start, that if this guy does get elected, I promise you the Senate Ethics Committee will vote to expel him. And because that's a nonpartisan committee, there's an equal number of Democrats as Republicans. Mitch McConnell, back when I was working in the Senate, was the chairman of the Senate Ethics Committee. So him saying today, I believe the women's story, in effect, expels Roy Moore if he makes it to the Senate. But let's see. Let's see what happens. There's polls indicating it's very close now. Let's see what happens.
Hi, good evening.
Very trivial after the last one. However, I was interested in your anecdote about the press. As we look back, how the press and media so impacted the campaign and the way in which we communicate each other. And Nixon described the press as an enemy of the people. If I flash forward to the president, we now have a president who's looking at media and the press as enemies of the state and driven by fake news. I'd really like to give a tip of the hat today to the young men and women that are coming into journalism, into the media, extraordinary written and communication talent I have a bias to MSNBC, but we see it at CNN and across the spectrum. Looking back on your career, what advice would you give to these young people now who are viewed as, quote, unquote, an enemy?
I would say I have a different view of this than I think a lot of people in that business. I'd say whatever you can do, don't study journalism.
I'd second that.
Do not study that. Study something that's real, that's going to give you a frame on news. Study economics. They should all study economics. Major in economics rather than journalism, for example. Major in history, anything other than that. So that you have a real grounding in knowledge as opposed to process, which is what journalism is about. You can learn the process. You can learn it really quickly. And it's a relatively easy process. And if you're in an institution like NBC News or, a real news organization, they're going to impose their process on you anyway. But really, I would say arm yourself with the kinds of equipment you're going to need when someone says to you, if we cut taxes dramatically, the deficit won't go up at all. Just please take a class that allows you to respond to that in real time when they say it.
On this subject of the media, I do want to solicit just a quick story from you, Lawrence, about 1968 and Roger Ailes.
So the first sentence of the book, the very first sentence, is Roger Ailes meeting Mike Douglas in the makeup chair, meeting Richard Nixon in the makeup chair at the Mike Douglas show. And so Roger Ailes was the young executive producer of the Mike Douglas show, which was like the Ellen DeGeneres show of its day. Nixon complains to him about, why am I doing this kind of silly TV instead of Meet the Press and serious political TV? Roger Ailes then spends 15 minutes telling Nixon everything he doesn't understand about TV, everything he got wrong about TV when he was running against Jack Kennedy, and how hopeless Nixon's approach to TV is. And Nixon loves this, just loves it. No one talks to the former vice president that way. And he's learning a lot from this guy, Ailes, and he invites Roger Ailes, begs him to come into his presidential campaign, and Roger Ailes gives up show business, goes into presidential campaigning, and the rest is tragic history. He helps Nixon get elected. He makes Nixon's campaign on the television side the most advanced we'd ever seen. He helps him get reelected. He helps Reagan get elected. He helps George H.W. Bush get elected. And then Rupert Murdoch asks Roger Ailes to create Fox News. And without Fox News carrying Donald Trump every step of the way, we would have a different president tonight were it not for Richard Nixon pulling Roger Ailes out of show business and into politics.
It was the lazy shave in 1960. It was the lazy shave. Hi, good evening. Thank you for your patience.
Good evening. Quick question. I read Chris Matthews' book on Bobby Kennedy. Amazing. Great book. And I look at the way he described Bobby Kennedy back then and how he was essential running his brother's campaign and getting him to the White House. Today, who is the Bobby Kennedy in the Democratic Party?
You could have asked. There's a certain version of Bobby Kennedy that's mythologized, and in every way, including exaggerated descriptions of just how great a campaign manager he was at the presidential level. He was good. He was a good, solid presidential campaign manager. He was a fairly typical politician of his day. He evolved in the 1960s from what at a certain point in the 1950s you would call at best a moderate Democrat. You wouldn't call him a conservative Democrat because we had, Alabama Democrats then and Georgia and Mississippi Democrats who were much more conservative. But what you watch in Bobby Kennedy in the 1960s and in this book is the evolution of a man in middle age in America in the 1960s. Kennedys. And there's not one person in America who thought the same thing in 1968 that he or she thought in 1961. Not one person. They changed their minds about all sorts of things. There were people who were segregationists in 1961 who were not in 1968. And Bobby traveled a very complicated road to get where he ended up getting to. But one of the struggles he had as a presidential candidate, one of the very serious struggles he had, was just how much he was hated. And this is a very easy thing to overlook in the mythologizing of the Kennedys, as the South called them, because they saw them as the Kennedys, the president and the attorney general, who forced the integration of the University of Alabama by sending in the troops and a deputy attorney general to do it. So there was hatred not just around the country for the Kennedys, but Bobby Kennedy, because he was such a sharp and tough and very ruthless operator within Democratic politics, had an awful lot of people within Democratic politics who hated him, chief among them Lyndon Johnson, and many, 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 many others. And so one of his struggles, had he not been assassinated on the night that he won the California primary, was going to be convincing delegates in Chicago who did not like him, whose paths he had crossed, who were hurt by previous political maneuverings that he had done for his brother Jack and for others, trying to convince them to come on board, the Bobby for President campaign. It was going to be complex, but he was uniquely gifted as a person in being able to pull that off, because he really did have a personal charm that we had never seen before in a presidential candidate, and more than his brother Jack had, because his brother Jack was the first Kennedy to get to national prominence, and he had the movie star looks and all of that, and we'd never seen that in presidential campaigning before. It was a whole new thing. But remember, when Bobby emerges as a presidential candidate, he's doing so in the tragic shadow of his assassinated brother. And so when those audiences are looking up at him on a stage before he's decided to run, and they're chanting, "Run, Bobby, run," they don't just want Bobby Kennedy to be president. They want a restoration of the first Kennedy presidency. They are looking at this man who, no matter how much he smiles, looks to them to be a tragic figure whose very being in front of them demands the restoration of this Kennedy presidency, of this dream. And when Teddy Kennedy took his turn running for president and failed, and Teddy did something that he advised Bobby not to do. Teddy advised Bobby, do not run against Lyndon Johnson. Do not do it. Do not challenge the Democratic president of your own party. Teddy did exactly that when he decided to run, challenged the Democratic president of his own party, and he lost. And in his final speech, as a conceding presidential candidate, the final line of it was, "The dream shall never die." And the dream, of course, was a Kennedy presidency. And so that was a unique advantage that Bobby Kennedy had that no candidate in history ever had. It was also the single biggest personal burden that any presidential candidate has ever had. Bobby worried that another Kennedy candidacy would provoke a copycat assassination. When Martin Luther King was assassinated that night, Bobby said to one of his aides, "That could have been me." 2 months later, it was. Jackie Kennedy wanted Bobby to run because she knew Bobby wanted to. She told him to run. And then she privately told a friend she thought that what would happen to Bobby would be the same as what happened to Jack. And so this air of tragedy was around him all the time. And it has created a certain kind of romanticism about him that can overlook this vast army of enemies he made because he was in the thick of real politics in Washington and the Democratic Party, and no one has ever been in the center of that without creating enemies.
Who is that candidate for 2020? Who's that man or that woman?
I don't know.
All right.
It's maybe Rachel Maddow, I don't know.
Hi, good evening. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I realize that a lot of people may not think this, but I consider Trump a Russian asset. And he has, in this short time he's been president, he's created such immense damage to the United States. And I feel like he's doing point by point what Putin wants. One destructive act after another, just recently with China and Korea. And I realize that Mueller has to take his time and do a detailed investigation, but if he's finished in 2 years, the damage may be unbelievable. So I just, wanted to know your opinion.
I'm very, very patiently waiting for Donald Trump to do anything that Vladimir Putin doesn't want. Anything. One thing. Say one thing, one sentence. We haven't seen it. It's a remarkable thing. And you would think that someone who has these accusations of and suspicions of collusion with the Russians surrounding his campaign, any other politician would go out of his way to try to show you some kind of break with Russia, some kind of disagreement with Putin, anything. And he doesn't feel compelled to do that. It is really a remarkable thing to watch.
Earlier, Lawrence, you spoke about how the country was able to heal after the transformative election in 1968. What were some of those ingredients, and do you see evidence of those today?
It's the same ingredient. Healing is always the same ingredient. It's time. It took time. And April 29th, 1975 was the last American soldier killed in Vietnam. And we simply needed some time from that. And as we got through it, as the country moved forward, it felt distant pretty quickly. And one of the reasons that it felt distant is there was no romanticizing about it. There was no moment in Times Square. There was no VJ Day. There was no VE Day. There was nothing like that. And so it just kind of drifted into memory quietly. And the country then found its prosperity again and kind of got on its legs. And I think what the country kind of subconsciously concluded was, this will never happen again. This was our last war. If there's another war, it will be over something extreme and important, and it will be major if we have one. But the incentives not to have war are just increasing every day, because the big powers we could have war with all have nuclear weapons like we do, which actually reduces the likelihood. And I think we kind of drifted into a space where we got to conclude we'll never make that kind of mistake again. We'll never go to war in a jungle we don't understand for reasons we don't understand. And I think we started to feel safe because of that we had learned this horrible and painful lesson, but because we've learned it from this point forward, we won't face these kinds of risks again. We won't drift mistakenly into this kind of accident again, which is the best you could call Vietnam, would be an accident. There was actually some real deliberate choice made there that was made in a publicly false way. With the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and all of the basis for that was totally false. But the country, I believe, felt like the lessons were learned. The basic objectives of the Civil Rights Movement had been achieved: the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. And so it felt like there were some wins here, that the Civil Rights Movement had won. The peace movement had won. It took years longer than the peace movement wanted it to, but the peace movement had won. And so it felt like protest worked. The world was changed by protest. The United States was changed by protest. We were set on a course that felt like a kind of societal stability, to the point where you could elect a president in 1980 almost exclusively because of taxes, almost exclusively. Whereas in 1968, it wasn't mentioned. It was not mentioned. And when you think about it, what that meant was we were luxuriating in peace. we were a content enough country about our position in the world, about the risks that we were facing and not facing, about the safety of our children, the safety of our young men who were not being drafted and sent to war, that we had reached so much contentment in these areas that were previously nothing but turmoil, that we could actually get down to something like taxes. Am I paying too much in taxes? Yeah, I think I am. So Reagan, okay. That's where we were. If you want to look at it, from the distance of what's the good news about that? If you were, let's say you were a Carter supporter, or you were an opponent of Ronald Reagan's, well, one of the reasons that was able to happen is that the big, turbulent, riot-producing issues of the 20th century had calmed to the point and reached a point of control and contentment, that people were able to start looking at other things and finding their discontents elsewhere in the government over things that, pardon me, are relatively minor compared to someone's right to vote, or compared to the threat that the United States government is going to take you and send you to your death in a jungle for a reason you don't understand.
Playing with Fire, ladies and gentlemen, Lawrence O'Donnell here at the Miami Book Fair.